This documentary is presented for historical and educational analysis only. The content draws from publicly available sources, declassified documents, academic research, and journalistic investigations. This presentation does not advocate for, glorify, or justify any actions discussed herein, nor does it represent political endorsement. The purpose is to examine institutional evolution within intelligence organizations during a specific historical period. Viewers are encouraged to consult primary sources and multiple perspectives when forming conclusions about these events. Bureaucracies rarely collapse overnight. They erode slowly through accumulated failures that no single person notices until the foundation cracks. In the spring of 1989, an unnamed Israeli intelligence official accepted a resignation that had been years in the making. The departing director had overseen 7 years marked not by celebrated triumphs, but by a succession of crises that would force the most secretive intelligence organization in the Western world to confront an uncomfortable question. Had operational autonomy become institutional liability? This was not the story anyone expected from an agency whose reputation had been built on precision and discretion. The 1980s began with confidence. Israel's Foreign Intelligence Service had emerged from previous decades with a reputation for audacious operations and strategic wins. But confidence, when unchecked by accountability, creates blind spots. And in intelligence work, blind spots prove catastrophic. What followed was not a purge in the traditional sense. No mass firings, no public trials, no dramatic restructuring announced in headlines. Instead, it was something more subtle and perhaps more significant. An institutional reckoning forced by scandals that exposed fundamental weaknesses in how the organization operated, answered to civilian authority, and balanced national security with international relationships.
By the time the decade ended, the agency had been forced to confront failures that threatened its relationship with its most important ally, compromised its operational security, and raised questions about whether an intelligence service operating in near-total secrecy could function effectively in a democratic state. This is the story of how crisis became catalyst, how embarrassment forced evolution, and how an organization built on shadows had to learn, however reluctantly, to function with greater light. To understand what happened in the 1980s, we must first understand what Mossad had become by then. The Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, known simply as Mossad, was established in December 1949, barely a year after Israel's founding. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion created it to focus on external intelligence.com, distinguishing it from Shin Bet, which handled internal security, and Amman, which managed military intelligence. From its inception, Mossad occupied a unique position in Israeli governance. The agency reported directly to the Prime Minister's office, and its existence was initially such a closely guarded secret that even speaking its name in public was illegal until the mid-1960s, EBSCO. This extreme secrecy came with a significant consequence. Because Mossad and other intelligence agencies were not publicly acknowledged, they were not bound by the same constitutional laws as Israel's citizens and other institutions, EBSCO. The organization's formative years occurred during the Cold War's most intense period. Israel, surrounded by hostile states that had invaded immediately upon its founding, viewed intelligence as existential rather than merely strategic. Every neighboring country formally denied Israel's right to exist. The United Nations offered limited protection. Western powers provided inconsistent support.
In this environment, Mossad developed an operational culture that prioritized results over process, secrecy over accountability, and immediate security over long-term diplomatic considerations. The agency's second director, Issa Harel, served from 1952 to 1963 and was credited with building Mossad into a highly professional organization capable of conducting operations around the world, Encyclopedia Britannica. Under his leadership, the agency executed operations that became legendary, most notably the 1960 capture of Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann from Argentina. But the Eichmann operation, while operationally successful, also established a troubling precedent. Argentina protested what it considered a violation of its sovereignty, and the United Nations Security Council noted that repetition of such acts would involve a breach of principles upon which international order is founded. Wikipedia. The international community's message was clear:
Even when pursuing justified ends, sovereign states cannot simply violate other nations' territory. Mossad's leadership took note, but not necessarily to heart. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the agency expanded its capabilities and reputation. Director Meir Amit, who served from 1963 to 1968, introduced computerization and organized strategic planning, Encyclopedia.com. His reforms proved valuable during the Six-Day War, when Israeli intelligence provided comprehensive information about enemy capabilities. But success bred overconfidence. After the spectacular intelligence work preceding the 1967 war, there was a tendency to believe the system was working optimally. Failure to predict Egyptian actions leading to the Yom Kippur War in 1973 forced the resignation of several top officers, including Mossad director Zvi Zamir, Encyclopedia.com. This failure should have prompted fundamental reform. It did not. Instead, the intelligence community interpreted the Yom Kippur surprise as a specific analytical failure rather than a symptom of deeper structural problems. By the time Nahum Admoni assumed the directorship in 1982, the organization he inherited operated with minimal external oversight, answered primarily to the prime minister, and had developed a culture where operational success was rewarded, but institutional accountability was largely absent. The geopolitical landscape of the early 1980s created new pressures. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 had eliminated a key intelligence partner. Before the revolution, Israel's Mossad had been increasingly active in Iran, training Savak personnel, Wikipedia. The Cold War continued, but regional dynamics were shifting in ways that traditional intelligence approaches struggled to address. Meanwhile, Israel's relationship with the United States had become increasingly central to its security strategy. This relationship required delicate balance. The U.S. provided crucial military aid and diplomatic support, but American intelligence agencies operated under different legal frameworks and faced congressional oversight that Israeli intelligence services did not. This was the institutional landscape when the 1980s began, an intelligence organization with enormous capabilities, minimal oversight, a culture that prioritized operational results, and growing dependencies on international relationships that required trust and reciprocity. What happened next would test whether such an organization could sustain itself, or whether accumulated contradictions would force fundamental change. To understand how the organization transformed, we must examine how it actually functioned institutionally, not through dramatic operations, but through the mundane reality of organizational structure and internal culture. By the late 1980s, Mossad's staff was estimated at between 1,500 to 2,000 personnel, FAS. This relatively small size created both advantages and vulnerabilities. Small organizations can be nimble and maintain tighter operational security. They can also develop insularity and groupthink. The agency consisted of 8 departments, with the collections department being the largest, responsible for espionage operations with offices abroad under both diplomatic and unofficial cover, FAS. Other divisions included political action and liaison, which conducted relations with foreign intelligence services, and a technology department responsible for developing advanced capabilities. But organizational charts reveal little about institutional culture. The more significant factor was accountability, or its absence. Journalist Ronan Bergman has described Mossad as a deep state due to its accountability directly to the prime minister and not to the Knesset, Wikipedia. This meant the agency operated without legislative oversight that characterized intelligence agencies in many Western democracies. In the United States, congressional intelligence committees could demand briefings, review budgets, and investigate failures. In Britain, parliamentary committees exercised oversight functions. Israel's Knesset had no equivalent mechanism for Mossad. This created an unusual dynamic. The prime minister held theoretical authority over Mossad's operations, but prime ministers changed with political fortune, while the intelligence bureaucracy maintained institutional continuity. Directors served for years, sometimes under multiple prime ministers. This gave the agency significant practical autonomy in defining its own mission parameters. The absence of external oversight created internal effects. Without mechanisms for outside review, organizational learning depended entirely on internal assessment. Successful operations were studied and replicated. Failed operations might be examined internally, but without external pressure to implement systemic reforms. Furthermore, Nahum Admoni became the first Mossad director to have grown entirely within the agency, Jewish Virtual Library, when appointed in 1982. Previous directors had often come from military intelligence or other backgrounds, bringing external perspectives. Admoni's internal rise meant he had been socialized entirely within Mossad's institutional culture. He knew its capabilities intimately, but perhaps accepted its limitations as inevitable. The relationship between Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies added another layer of complexity. The Israeli intelligence community consisted of Military Intelligence Directorate, Mossad, Shabak, Shin Bet, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Center for Political Research, though usually only the first three were involved in main collection and analysis efforts, Taylor and Francis Online. Coordination between these agencies was imperfect. Each had its own priorities, methods, and institutional interests. Information sharing occurred, but not systematically. Competition for resources and political favor created friction. There was also LACOM, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, which operated under the Defense Ministry rather than the Prime Minister's office. LACOM's purpose was to collect information on science and technology to support Israel's military-industrial sector and nuclear program from both open-source and clandestine sources, UPEN. This created yet another intelligence entity operating with minimal coordination with Mossad. The Mossad and Shabak considered LACOM amateurish and haphazard in its spying exploits, UPEN, but interagency rivalry meant concerns about LACOM's methods were not systematically addressed through proper channels. The institutional structure, in summary, created an environment where individual agencies operated with significant autonomy, minimal external oversight, imperfect coordination, and internal cultures that had developed over decades without substantial external pressure to reform.
This might have continued indefinitely, if not for the particular sequence of failures that occurred during the 1980s. These were not abstract organizational problems. They were concrete crises that damaged Israel's most important international relationships, compromised operational security, and forced questions about whether the existing institutional arrangement remained viable. The institutional crisis that engulfed Mossad in the 1980s did not announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It accumulated through a sequence of failures, each exposing different weaknesses in how Israeli intelligence operated. The first major crisis emerged not from Mossad directly, but from the intelligence bureaucracy it should have been coordinating with. In November 1985, American authorities arrested Jonathan Pollard, a civilian intelligence analyst for the U.S. Navy. Pollard was found to be an Israeli spy working for LACOM, Wikipedia. The revelation shocked the American intelligence community and severely damaged U.S.-Israeli relations. What made the Pollard affair particularly damaging was not merely that Israel had been conducting espionage against its closest ally. Intelligence services sometimes collect information from friendly nations. The problem was how it occurred and how Israel responded. LACOM did not adhere to the policy against recruiting American Jewish agents, UPEN, violating an understanding that Israeli intelligence agencies had supposedly maintained to protect both U.S.-Israeli relations and American Jewish communities from accusations of dual loyalty. When the operation was exposed, the Israeli government's initial response worsened the damage. The Israelis preferred to settle the matter quietly and diplomatically. The Americans treated it as a public legal investigation, UPEN. This disconnect revealed different assumptions about accountability and transparency that strained the bilateral relationship.
For Nahum Admoni and Mossad, the Pollard affair created multiple problems. Although LACOM, not Mossad, had run Pollard, the distinction meant little to American intelligence officials, who now questioned whether they could trust any Israeli intelligence agency. The entire Israeli intelligence community became suspect. Following the Pollard story, Israel stated that it renounces any espionage against the United States, Wikipedia. But the damage to trust had been done. American intelligence officials became more cautious about sharing sensitive information with Israeli counterparts. But the Pollard affair was only the beginning of Admoni's troubles. In 1986, another crisis emerged that would prove even more damaging to Mossad's operational security and international reputation. Mordecai Vanunu had worked as a technician at Israel's Dimona nuclear facility. Fired in 1985, reportedly for his political views, Vanunu subsequently provided photographs and information about Israel's nuclear program to a British newspaper. Mossad used an undercover agent to lure Vanunu from the United Kingdom to Italy, where he was abducted and returned to Israel, Wikipedia, to face trial for treason. The operation itself was technically successful. Vanunu was captured and returned to Israel, but the broader consequences were disastrous. First, the operation was not sufficiently covert. Details of how Mossad had lured and captured Vanunu became public, exposing operational methods and demonstrating that Israeli intelligence would conduct kidnapping operations in allied European nations. Second, the very fact that Vanunu had access to such sensitive information and was able to leave Israel with it exposed serious security failures. Lecom, which was in charge of security at the Dimona reactor, failed to notice that Vanunu had smuggled a camera into the secure facility and spent extensive time photographing it. Shabak, in turn, overlooked the fact that Vanunu had traveled abroad. Wikipedia.
These were not sophisticated intelligence failures. They were basic security lapses. A disgruntled employee with access to one of Israel's most sensitive facilities had spent months photographing classified information, then left the country. And only after he had already contacted foreign media did Israeli intelligence become aware of the threat. The Vanunu affair exposed a fundamental problem. Israeli intelligence agencies were so focused on external threats and offensive operations that they had neglected basic counterintelligence and internal security. Then there was Iran-Contra. During the mid-1980s, the Reagan administration became embroiled in a scandal involving arms sales to Iran and the illegal funding of Nicaraguan Contra rebels. Israeli involvement in the Iran-Contra affair was among Mossad's less successful activities during this period, encyclopedia.com. The exact nature and extent of Israeli intelligence involvement in Iran-Contra remains partially obscure, but Admoni endured the revelation of Israeli involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, Wikipedia, as another blow to the agency's reputation and its relationship with American intelligence agencies. Each of these crises, Pollard, Vanunu, Iran-Contra, revealed different institutional weaknesses. Coordination failure. Lecom's operation against the United States proceeded without adequate coordination with Mossad or consideration of broader strategic consequences. Security failure. Basic counterintelligence measures failed to prevent Vanunu from accessing, photographing, and leaving Israel with highly classified information. Strategic judgment failure. Involvement in Iran-Contra entangled Israeli intelligence in American domestic political controversies in ways that damaged long-term relationships for questionable short-term gains. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these crises was what they revealed about accountability and learning within the Israeli intelligence system.
In the United States, the Pollard affair led to extensive internal reviews, new security protocols, and legislative hearings. Iran-Contra triggered congressional investigations, prosecutions, and institutional reforms. In Israel, the response was more muted. Admoni was criticized by the Kahan Commission for not warning the cabinet, Wikipedia, regarding earlier events in Lebanon, but no significant action against him was recommended. The various intelligence failures of the 1980s did not trigger comprehensive external review or systematic reform. This absence of external accountability mechanisms meant that internal learning depended entirely on internal processes, and internal processes, shaped by organizational culture that prioritized operational success and secrecy, were not well suited to fundamental questioning of how the agency operated. Contemporary media characterized Admoni as a colorless figure associated with perceived Mossad setbacks in Europe, Wikipedia, but these criticisms remained largely in the realm of journalistic commentary rather than official review. By the late 1970s, the intelligence community had acquired a shabby reputation, Wikipedia, and the 1980s had not improved matters. Yet the institutional structures that had produced these failures remained largely unchanged. The conflict ultimately was not between Mossad and external enemies. It was between an institutional model built on autonomy and secrecy and a changing environment that demanded greater accountability, better coordination, and more careful consideration of long-term strategic relationships over short-term operational gains. This was not the kind of conflict that could be resolved through a single operation or policy change. It required rethinking fundamental assumptions about how intelligence should function in a democratic state that depended heavily on international relationships.
Admoni concluded 35 years of service in Israeli intelligence,
having reported directly to prime ministers, including Yitzhak Shamir, Menachem Begin, and Shimon Peres. When he resigned in 1989, it marked the end of an era. But whether it would mark the beginning of genuine institutional transformation remained uncertain. The failures of the 1980s were not primarily failures of technical capability. Mossad remained highly skilled at the craft of intelligence. The failures were organizational and procedural, problems of coordination, oversight, and strategic judgment. Consider the bureaucratic mechanisms meant to prevent disasters like the Pollard affair. In theory, Israeli intelligence agencies operated within a coordinated framework. Different agencies had defined jurisdictions. Mossad handled foreign intelligence, Shin Bet managed internal security, Amman focused on military intelligence, and the Foreign Ministry's Research Center provided diplomatic intelligence. In practice, coordination was imperfect. Agencies competed for resources, influence, and credit for successes. They guarded their sources and methods jealously, sharing information selectively. When Lacam began running Pollard, there was no effective mechanism to ensure this operation was reviewed by other agencies that might have recognized the strategic risks. The absence of legislative oversight exacerbated these coordination problems. In intelligence communities with strong legislative oversight, coordination failures often come to light through external review. Congress might discover that two agencies were conducting conflicting operations, or that important information wasn't being shared. This external pressure creates incentives for better coordination. Without such oversight, Israeli intelligence agencies coordinated only to the extent they perceived immediate operational benefit.
Strategic coordination, ensuring that multiple agencies' activities aligned with long-term national interests, occurred primarily through the Prime Minister's office. But prime ministers, focused on immediate political and security challenges, rarely had the capacity for systematic review of intelligence coordination. The case of Mordecai Vanunu illustrated different procedural failures. Counterintelligence, protecting one's own secrets, requires systematic processes. Background checks, security clearances, periodic reviews, monitoring of unusual behavior, controlled access to sensitive information. These are unglamorous but essential functions. The security failure that allowed Vanunu to photograph extensively inside the Dimona facility represented a breakdown in basic procedures. Wikipedia. Someone with his access should have been subject to continuous security review. His possession of a camera in secure areas should have triggered immediate investigation. His travel abroad should have been monitored. None of these procedures functioned effectively. This suggested not an isolated failure, but a systemic underinvestment in defensive intelligence capabilities. Mossad's culture emphasized offensive operations, recruiting agents, conducting operations abroad, gathering intelligence on enemies. The defensive work of counterintelligence received less attention and fewer resources. This imbalance reflected broader institutional priorities. Successful offensive operations brought prestige. Directors built reputations through daring raids and recruited agents. Defensive work was invisible when successful and obvious only when it failed. The bureaucratic incentive structure, in other words, naturally led to underinvestment in exactly the capabilities that might have prevented the 1980s failures. There were also questions about analytical processes and strategic assessment.
Intelligence agencies collect information, but they must also analyze it, determining what it means, identifying patterns, assessing implications. Good analysis requires certain conditions. Analysts need access to relevant information from multiple sources, time to think carefully rather than respond to immediate demands, and institutional cultures that reward accuracy over telling leadership what they want to hear. The 1980s crises suggested Israeli intelligence struggled with strategic analysis. The Pollard operation should have been questioned on strategic grounds. Even if it produced valuable intelligence, was the risk to U.S.-Israeli relations worth it? Iran-Contra involvement should have prompted questions about whether short-term tactical cooperation served long-term strategic interests. These questions required thinking beyond immediate operational success to consider broader context and long-term consequences. But institutional cultures built around operational excellence don't naturally produce such strategic thinking. There is also the matter of internal reform mechanisms. Organizations learn through feedback. Private companies get feedback from markets. If their products fail, they lose money. Democratic governments get feedback from voters. If policies fail, politicians lose elections.
Intelligence agencies operate in shadows. Their successes often remain classified. Their failures may be concealed or rationalized. Without strong external oversight, how do they receive feedback necessary for learning? Prominent Israeli political scientist Alec Epstein wrote that intelligence services built on absolute secrecy, without regular external control mechanisms, are doomed to stagnation, and in this regard, the numerous failures of Shabak and Mossad seemed more natural than accidental. Wikipedia. This analysis identified a fundamental problem. The same secrecy that enabled effective operations also prevented effective learning. Without external review, internal assessment became circular. The organization judged itself by its own standards and found its performance acceptable. During Admoni's tenure, there were attempts at internal reform. Under his leadership, Mossad established covert ties with additional countries and worked on operations like rescuing Ethiopian Jews, Jewish Virtual Library. These represented operational successes that demonstrated the agency's capabilities. But operational success and institutional health are different things. An organization can execute impressive operations while its underlying structures become increasingly dysfunctional. The question was whether the 1980s crises would finally create sufficient pressure for genuine structural reform, or whether the intelligence community would treat them as isolated incidents requiring minor adjustments rather than fundamental rethinking. When Admoni's resignation was announced in March 1989, it occurred amid scrutiny about Mossad's setbacks, Wikipedia, but the institutional response remained unclear. What was certain was that the methods that had served Mossad well in earlier decades, operational daring, bureaucratic autonomy, minimal oversight, had proven inadequate for the challenges of the 1980s. The question was whether anyone had the will and authority to implement the difficult reforms that situation demanded. By the late 1980s, criticism of Mossad was coming from multiple directions, each highlighting different aspects of the institutional crisis. From the United States, the criticism focused on trust and reciprocity. American intelligence officials had long valued the Israeli relationship. Israel provided intelligence on Middle Eastern developments that American agencies struggled to obtain. Israeli technical capabilities were impressive. The relationship was genuinely useful to both sides. But the Pollard affair shattered assumptions of reciprocal trust. From the American perspective, Israel had not merely collected intelligence from an ally. Many countries do that. Israel had recruited an American citizen, violated the implicit understanding against targeting American Jews, and then failed to cooperate fully with the investigation. American intelligence professionals, speaking on background to journalists, made clear their anger and sense of betrayal. Some advocated for drastically reducing intelligence cooperation with Israel. Others pushed for new security protocols to prevent similar breaches. The spy case led to a cooling of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, upend, with lasting effects on intelligence cooperation. Years later, American officials would still reference Pollard when explaining their reluctance to share certain categories of intelligence with Israeli counterparts. From European allies, criticism centered on operational methods and sovereignty violations. The Vanunu kidnapping in Italy demonstrated that Mossad was willing to conduct operations on European soil that violated local laws. This raised questions for European governments. If Israeli intelligence would kidnap someone from Italy, what operations might it conduct in London, Paris, or Berlin? During the 1990s, problems in Mossad's work continued, with agents arrested in Nicosia while installing eavesdropping equipment in the Iranian embassy in 1991, Wikipedia, suggesting the lesson about respecting allied nation sovereignty had not been fully internalized. Within Israel itself, criticism came from multiple quarters. Journalists, particularly investigative reporters who had developed sources within the intelligence community, began writing more critically about Mossad's performance. Tel Aviv media characterized Admoni as associated with perceived setbacks, Wikipedia, though specific details often remained classified. Academic and policy analysts raised broader questions about intelligence oversight and democratic accountability. Analysts argued that professional organizations functioning without regular external control and cross-review were doomed to stagnation. Wikipedia. The argument was not that Mossad should abandon secrecy. Intelligence requires confidentiality to function.
Rather, the argument was that some form of external oversight was necessary to provide the feedback and accountability that would prevent the kind of failures witnessed in the 1980s. Political criticism was more muted, partly because Israeli politicians had limited information about intelligence operations, and partly because criticizing intelligence agencies was politically sensitive in a nation facing genuine security threats. But some political figures did speak up. After various scandals, there were calls in the Knesset for greater legislative oversight of intelligence agencies. These calls generally failed to gain traction. The security establishment resisted external oversight, and most politicians were hesitant to be seen as undermining intelligence capabilities. There was also internal criticism within the intelligence community itself. Career intelligence officers who had watched the 1980s unfold recognized the damage to institutional credibility. Some pushed internally for reforms, better coordination mechanisms, stronger counterintelligence, more systematic strategic assessment. These voices faced resistance from those who believed the problems were individual failures rather than systemic issues. Along with other embarrassing incidents involving careless mistakes by Mossad agents, Admoni retired in 1989, Wikipedia. The phrasing "retired" suggested a managed departure rather than a forceful removal, but the timing and context made clear his departure was connected to the accumulated failures. The resignation ceremony took place at the Prime Minister's office, where Shamir personally thanked Admoni for his contributions, Wikipedia.
This diplomatic handling reflected Israeli political culture's tendency to manage such transitions quietly rather than conducting public reckonings. Admoni had come into the top intelligence post unexpectedly in 1982 during Israel's invasion of Lebanon, when the man designated as the new chief, General Yekutiel Adam, was killed during the invasion, ProQuest. He inherited an organization already facing challenges and presided over 7 years of accumulated crises. Whether Admoni personally bore responsibility for the failures is debatable. Many of the problems predated his tenure. The institutional structures that enabled the failures were established long before he became director. But leadership includes responsibility for addressing systemic problems, and by that measure, the 1980s represented a failure of institutional leadership to recognize and address fundamental weaknesses before they produced catastrophic results. The institutional crisis of the 1980s produced consequences that shaped Israeli intelligence for decades afterward, though not always in the ways reformers might have hoped. The most immediate consequence was damage to international relationships, particularly with the United States. Intelligence cooperation depends on trust. One agency shares sensitive information with another because it believes that information will be protected and used responsibly. The Pollard affair severely damaged American intelligence agencies' trust in their Israeli counterparts. This had practical effects. American intelligence became more cautious about what it shared with Israel. Certain categories of intelligence, particularly information that could reveal American sources and methods, became subject to stricter controls. Joint operations required higher-level approval. The relationship eventually recovered to some degree, but the Pollard affair cast a long shadow. Israeli intelligence was instrumental to U.S.
interests, especially in regional matters, counterterrorism, and joint military exercises, APEN, which created incentives for both sides to maintain cooperation despite the breach of trust. But the easy assumption of complete alignment of interests was gone. Within Israel, the 1980s crises renewed debates about intelligence oversight that continue to this day. The crisis in the intelligence services in the 1980s and 1990s led Israeli society to believe there was need for legislative regulation and independent control, Wikipedia. Various proposals were advanced for creating parliamentary oversight committees, similar to those in the United States or United Kingdom. Most of these proposals failed to achieve implementation. The security establishment consistently opposed external oversight, arguing it would compromise operational security. Politicians remained hesitant to challenge the intelligence community on these issues. The political culture valued consensus on security matters. Some modest reforms were implemented. A legal advisor position was established, with the first legal advisor who did not grow within the agency arriving at Mossad in 2002, Taylor and Francis Online, bringing external legal perspective to operational decisions. But comprehensive legislative oversight of the kind common in other democracies was not established. Mossad's purpose, objectives, roles, missions, powers, or budget have not been defined in any law, Taylor and Francis Online,
meaning the agency continues to operate without formal legislative framework. The 1980s also prompted some internal reforms within Mossad itself. There was increased emphasis on counterintelligence and security. The painful lessons of Vanunu were not entirely lost. Background checks became more rigorous. Security protocols were strengthened. There was greater attention to identifying insider threats. Coordination between intelligence agencies improved somewhat, though turf battles and information hoarding never disappeared entirely. LACOM, whose Pollard operation had caused such damage, was eventually disbanded, with its functions absorbed into other agencies. But structural reforms remained limited. The basic organizational model, multiple intelligence agencies with overlapping jurisdictions, limited external oversight, reporting primarily through the Prime Minister's office, persisted largely unchanged. Research into Mossad's post-Cold War adaptation demonstrated that despite reforms that took place over 2 decades, not much progress was achieved, Taylor and Francis Online, in fundamental institutional transformation. This partial reform, enough to address immediate embarrassments, but not enough to fundamentally restructure how Israeli intelligence operated, reflected deeper tensions in Israeli political culture about security and democracy. Israelis broadly support robust intelligence capabilities. The nation faces genuine security threats. Intelligence services have provided critical warnings and prevented attacks. There is political consensus that effective intelligence is essential to national survival. But effective intelligence in a democratic society requires balance. Capabilities must be sufficient without becoming threats to democratic governance and civil liberties. The 1980s demonstrated that Israeli intelligence had not achieved this balance. Problems in the work of intelligence services that began in the 1980s continued into the 1990s, with failures particularly frequent in Mossad, Wikipedia. Operations in Cyprus, Russia, Jordan, and Switzerland resulted in arrested agents and diplomatic embarrassments. These scandals led to Mossad director Danny Yatam's resignation in February 1998, Wikipedia. The pattern suggested that the institutional problems exposed in the 1980s had not been adequately addressed. Operational failures continued to occur with troubling frequency. Each prompted internal reviews and promises of reform. But without external oversight to force genuine accountability, the cycle of failure, review, limited reform, new failure continued. The long-term consequence, in summary, was persistent institutional dysfunction that superficial reforms could not address because the fundamental structures that produced failures remained unchanged. The institutional crisis that engulfed Mossad in the 1980s raises 2 profound questions that extend beyond Israeli intelligence to any democratic society's relationship with secretive institutions. What are the limits of intelligence in serving democratic states? And can ethical frameworks survive when decisions must be made under genuine uncertainty? Consider first the question of limits. Intelligence agencies serve legitimate state functions. Governments need information about threats, adversaries' capabilities and intentions, emerging technologies, and foreign political developments. Democratic states face genuine enemies who would exploit openness and legal constraints. Intelligence work necessarily occurs in shadows because transparency would negate effectiveness. But democracies also depend on accountability, rule of law, and citizen oversight of government power. These values conflict with intelligence requirements for secrecy and operational flexibility. The 1980s demonstrated what happens when this tension tilts too far toward intelligence autonomy. Without meaningful oversight, even well-intentioned professionals make decisions that serve short-term operational goals while undermining long-term strategic interests. The Pollard operation may have obtained valuable intelligence, but it damaged the most important bilateral relationship Israel maintained. This is not primarily about individual moral failings, it is about institutional structures. When agencies operate without external accountability, natural organizational dynamics, bureaucratic self-interest, operational tunnel vision, cultural insularity, pull toward decisions that optimize for agency interests rather than broader national interests. The solution is not abolishing intelligence agencies or eliminating secrecy. It is creating structures that balance operational requirements with accountability mechanisms sufficient to prevent the kind of systematic failures witnessed in the 1980s. Many democracies have developed such structures. Legislative oversight committees with security clearances who review intelligence activities in classified settings,
inspectors general with authority to investigate wrongdoing, sunset provisions that require periodic reauthorization of intelligence programs, judicial oversight of certain operations. These mechanisms involve trade-offs. They create procedural burdens, may occasionally compromise operations, and depend on political will to function effectively, but they provide the external feedback that prevents organizational stagnation and accumulating dysfunction. Israel's intelligence community largely avoided such structures, viewing them as incompatible with operational needs. The 1980s suggested this calculation was mistaken. The costs of inadequate accountability, damaged international relationships, compromised operations, persistent dysfunction, exceeded whatever operational benefits autonomous operations provided. The second question, whether ethics can survive uncertainty, is more subtle. Intelligence professionals face genuine dilemmas. Threats are real, information is incomplete, decisions must be made without knowing all consequences. The stakes are often measured in lives. In such circumstances, ethical frameworks face strain.
Simple rules: don't violate sovereignty, don't spy on allies, protect sources completely, prove inadequate because they conflict with operational necessities or other ethical obligations. The Vanunu case illustrates this tension. From one perspective, kidnapping someone from a foreign country violates sovereignty and rule of law. From another perspective, Vanunu had betrayed critical national security secrets, and allowing him to remain free encouraged further leaks that could undermine Israel's strategic deterrence. How should intelligence professionals resolve such dilemmas? The 1980s suggested that without institutional frameworks for ethical deliberation, decisions default to operational convenience and organizational interest. Kidnapping Vanunu was operationally simpler than pursuing legal extradition. Running Pollard was operationally attractive even if strategically short-sighted. But operational convenience is not ethical reasoning. Ethical frameworks that can survive uncertainty require institutional processes, consulting legal advisors, considering long-term consequences, weighing competing obligations, seeking authorization from civilian authorities. These processes don't eliminate dilemmas. Genuine ethical conflicts have no perfect solutions, but they ensure decisions are made deliberately rather than defaulting to whatever serves immediate operational interests. The human cost of the 1980s failures extended beyond institutional damage. Pollard spent 30 years in American prison. Vanunu spent 18 years imprisoned, 11 in solitary confinement. The individuals recruited or affected by these operations paid personal prices for institutional failures. The transformation forced upon Mossad by the 1980s crisis was incomplete and halting.
But it demonstrated a fundamental truth. Intelligence agencies cannot operate effectively in democracies without structures that balance operational requirements against accountability, short-term tactical gains against long-term strategic interests, and organizational prerogatives against broader democratic values. The story of Mossad in the 1980s is often told as a series of dramatic failures: the spy caught, the whistleblower kidnapped, the international scandal. But perhaps the more important story is quieter: the institutional transformation that was forced but never fully completed. When Nahum Admoni departed in 1989, he left an organization that had been compelled to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. The accumulated crises had demonstrated that operational excellence without institutional accountability produces dysfunction, that secrecy without oversight enables stagnation, that short-term tactical success can mask strategic failure. Some lessons were learned, security improved, coordination mechanisms developed, legal frameworks gradually emerged. Future directors would operate under slightly more constraint than their predecessors, but fundamental structures remained largely unchanged. The absence of meaningful legislative oversight continued. The institutional culture that prioritized operations over strategy persisted. The tensions between democratic accountability and intelligence requirements were managed rather than resolved. This partial transformation reflects broader questions about how democracies govern secretive institutions. Every democratic society faces this challenge. Every nation that maintains intelligence capabilities must balance security requirements against accountability imperatives. Israel's particular circumstances, genuine security threats, small size, regional isolation, create distinct pressures. But the fundamental dilemma is universal. How can institutions that require secrecy function within systems that depend on transparency? The 1980s provided no definitive answer to this question. Instead, they demonstrated costs of failing to address it seriously. Intelligence agencies that operate without sufficient oversight do not merely risk occasional embarrassments.
They risk systematic dysfunction that undermines the very security interests they exist to serve. What transformed in the 1980s was not Mossad's fundamental structure, but its reputation, among allies, within Israeli society, and perhaps within the organization itself. This reputational damage created pressure for reform that prior failures had not generated. Whether that pressure produced sufficient change remains debatable. The subsequent decades brought new controversies, new questions, new calls for reform. Perhaps that is the actual lesson. Institutional transformation is not an event, but a process, ongoing and incomplete, shaped by crisis and resistance in equal measure.